We begin today the Gemara at the Mishnah on Daf Mem Hey. A couple of lines down from the beginning of the Yamud. Zaktei the Mishnah Kotchei Oivdei Kechavim. Karbonis that Goyim donate to be brought in the Beis HaMikdash. They can donate karbonis as well. This is learned out actually from a pasuk where it says a double lashon, Ish Mibnei Yisrael. So the extra word Ish teaches that even a guy could donate a carbon. Ein chayav alei mishum pigel. However, if the kain that's bringing the carbon has the machshava of pigel, the chiyuv of kares, if you eat from that carbon, will not apply. And also naisar v'tamei, the halachas of naisar and tamei, if it was left after the time it's supposed to be eaten, or tamei, if the basar itself becomes tamei, so then the lav that applies to that, there'll be no malchus for this. It is going to be asr though, but it's not the chiyuv though, does not apply regarding the kachim of a guy. The Gemara will learn it out from a pasuk, as we'll see. And also v'ashoichtam b'chotz, if it's a carbon from a guy, anybody that shechts it outside the Beis HaMikdash, pater, will be pater for this. Divrei Rab Shimon, this is Rab Shimon's opinion. So regarding shoichtam b'chotz, Rab Shimon is saying that the whole halacha of shechting outside the Beis HaMikdash, if you look in the parsha, I think it's in Parshas Achrei Mos, where it speaks about the Isra of Shchuti Chutz, it says, Daber al Arim vel Bnei Yisrael, which means only a carbon that belongs to a Yid is there Isra of Shchuti Chutz. But a guy's carbon, he could donate a carbon and bring that carbon anywhere. It doesn't have to be brought to the Beis HaMikdash. And according to Rab Shimon, even any Yid could be makriv that carbon for the guy outside the Beis HaMikdash, anywhere. However, Rabbi Yosi mechayev. Rabbi Yosi says that you will be chayev, and from the Gemara you see that Rabbi Yosi is saying this not only regarding the last point of Shchuti Chutz, that a Yid may not bring the carbon of a guy outside the Beis HaMikdash, but regarding all the other details here it said in the Mishnah. Pigel, Neisar, Tamei, you'll be chayev. It applies by the carbon of a guy as well.
That means they want to do bomber.
Yeah, exactly. That's the idea. A guy can bring a carbon anywhere. Yeah. Regarding the guy himself, it's pashut that he can bring it anywhere. I believe the machlekes here is right. Regarding the yid bringing it for the guy, that's the machlekes here. Tana Rabbanon. So we learned in the Braise that explains the source for these halachas. Kotcha of the kechavim. So the Braise begins like this: there's the kotchim of a guy that he donated. Loinen, you're not allowed to have benefit from this. But on the other hand, the halacha of meila, menatayre, there's all the details. If you misappropriate hektish regarding the carbon you'd have to bring for this, or a payment of a chaimish, the halachas of meila menatayre do not apply by the kachim of a guy. And ve'en chayav aleim, like the halacha of the Mishnah, you're not chayav for this mishum pigel, noiser, v'tamei. And also, ve'ein oisim tumura, the halacha of tumura does not apply to a carbon of a guy. By the carbon of a yid, if you want to exchange one behem of a carbon for another, then what happens is the original one remains a carbon and the second one also becomes a carbon. But by a guy, this concept of tumura does not take effect. Ve'ein mevi'in nisachim, and a guy cannot bring nisachim as a carbon for itself. A yid could donate wine as a carbon for itself. But by a guy, he cannot bring nisachim as a carbon for itself. Aval karbonon ton nisachim. However, if a guy is donating a carbon and it's a kind of carbon that is supposed to come together with nisachim, then even by the carbon of a guy, you bring the nisachim together with the carbon. And when the guy donates this carbon, so you take from the funds that he donated to bring nisachim as well. And if his funds do not have enough to bring the nisachim as well, so then you have to take from the funds of the tzibur that in order to have the nisachim for this carbon. Divrei Rab Shimon. This is Rab Shimon's opinion, like it's said in the Mishnah. There's more details here in this, but I said this is Rab Shimon. Omar Rabbi Yosi. However, Rabbi Yosi says, Roye ani b'kulon lachachmer. I see regarding the carbon of a guy that will machmer by all these details, just like it applies by a yid, it applies the same by a guy. There's no difference. Why? Because Shenemar behen in the pasuk where we are marbed the fact that a guy can bring a carbon, it says in that pasuk Lashem, and this is the pasuk I mentioned before. At the beginning of the pasuk there, it says Daber al Bonov, and then it says Ish Mibnei Yisrael. The double lashon Ish is marbed that a guy could donate a carbon, and in that pasuk it speaks about the karbanis and it says Lashem. So what it's saying is that for a guy, when he donates a carbon, the carbon has the status to be La Hashem with all the stringencies, just like a regular carbon. Now, the Braisa continues another point. This is actually going back to the beginning of the Braisa regarding the halacha of Me'ila, according to Rab Shimon. Rab Shimon says that there's no me'ila by the carbon of a guy. That's only true regarding a carbon of a guy that he donated to be brought in the mizbeach. So there's no me'ila. However, the funds that a guy donated for the Beis Hamikdash that's used for other things, anything other than a carbon, so even by the donations of a guy, it becomes hektish, and the din of me'ila will apply to it. Here's the Braisa. Now the Gemara goes through the details of the Braisa to explain the sources and the pshat of everything. Okay, so Rab Shimon said, "Lo nenim v'lo mayale," and that by a guy you can't have ana, but there's no meila. What does this mean? Lo nenim midrabanan. This that you can't have ana from the carbon of a guy is only a takana midrabanan. But v'lo mayale, but minatayre, the kachim of a guy, you'll have ana. There's no din of meila from it. Why not? Because the gamar meila chet mitruma. There's a gzeira shavet learning out meila with the word chet that it says by meila to the word chet that it says by truma. The betrumik says, now by truma it says b'nei Yisrael v'lo yevdikachavim. That truma is when a yid separates the truma and not when a guy separates the truma. When a guy separates the truma, there's no truma. So just like by truma, it's only by a yid and not by a guy. So too, the din of meila is only by the carbon of a yid and not by the carbon of a guy. These three halachas, pigul, noiser, and tameh, the chiyuv on them does not apply by a guy. My time, what's the reason? The asi pigul, because there's a gzeira shaveh that you compare pigul to noiser. Ovin, the two words of ovin that it says by pigul, and the word ovin that it says by noiser, so you compare pigul to noiser. Now, how do you see from here that this only applies by a yid and not by a guy? Because then, the asi noiser, chilul mituma. Noiser itself, there's a gzeira shaveh comparing the halacha of noiser to tumah with the word of chilul. And regarding Tumah, the pasuk says, as we just quoted, B'nei Yisrael v'lo yevdikachavim, that it's a yid and not a guy. So if that's true by Tumah, so then we have a gzeira shaveh to say that it's also true by Naisar, and then we have a second gzeira shaveh to say that that's also true regarding Pigel, which is compared to Naisar. Therefore, all these three apply only by a yid, a carbon of a yid, and not a carbon of a guy. And there's also no tumura by a guy. My time, what's the source for this? Because the iskish tumura lemaiser behema. In the pasuk, tumura is compared to maiser behema. There's a hekish. Because in the pasuk, when it speaks about maiser behema, it says v'hoyahu utmurasai. Who means the original behema, which over there it's speaking about maiser behema, and then it says tumura. So these two, there's a hekish for these two. Okay, now maiser behema, regarding maiser behema, this does not apply by a guy. How do I know Ma'aser Behema is not by a guy? Because iskish leMa'aser Dagan. Because Ma'aser Behema is compared to the din of Ma'aser regarding grain. Over Ma'aser Dagan ksiv, and by Ma'aser for grain, the pasuk says B'nei Yisrael v'lo yevdikachavim, that the din of Ma'aser applies only by a yid and not by a guy. So therefore, we have the original source, which is the hekesh from Ma'aser Dagan, from grain, to Ma'aser Behema, that the Ma'aser of an animal does not apply to a guy. And then we have a second Hekish, once we know that Ma'aser Behema does not apply by a guy, so then we have a second Hekish that the Ma'aser, that the Tumura does not apply by a guy either. Now the Gemara asks on this, but v'chi davar halamed behekish, chayzer malamed behekish, regarding kachin, could you do such a kind of a limud, a double hekish, when you have something that you only know that the halacha is true there because of a hekish, could you then learn a second hekish to yet another place? We had this point before in the Gemara. This is a rule specifically regarding kachim. When you make a hekish by kachim, it has to be only one hekish. You can't have one hekish and then a secondary hekish. So how are we saying here that the source for Tmura is learned from Ma'aser Behema, and Ma'aser Behema was only learned from Ma'aser Dagan? And says the Gemara, Ma'aser Dagan chulunhu. Not all three over here are kachim. The original source, which is the Ma'aser by Dagan, that's not hektish. That's chulun, and therefore you could make a double hektish in such a case. So the Gemara asks, well, it's not necessarily true. There's a machlokes about this. One opinion that says, Basar milamed azlina. Regarding this rule, you can't make a double hekish, you have to look at the original source. So if the original source is chulin, so then you're able to make a second hekish. So then it's a good answer. But according to the opinion that says that you have to look not at the original source, you look at the first case that you learned out. 2. And so over here, the first case you learned out too is Maisa Behema. That's already Kachim. And now you're making a second Hekish from Maisa Behema to Tmura. So Michael Meimar, how are you going to answer? How are we making a second Hekish if by Kachim the rule is you can't make a secondary Hekish? And says the Gemara, Ella, the answer over here is you don't need a second Hekish B'chlal. Maisa Behema itself, without the Hekish to Maisa by grain. Maisa Behema itself, we know, does not apply by a guy, because Maisa Behema is a chayva, it's an obligation. Person has, in the herd of animals, he has 10 animals, so you have to separate the Maisa Behema. That's a mitzvah, a chayva, and that doesn't apply to a guy. She'en kavua lazman, and it also happens to be a mitzvah that doesn't have a set time in the year when you separate the Maisa Behema. It can be done any time of the year. The chayva she'en la zman kavua, a obligation, and it's an obligation also that doesn't have a set time. Yisrael Maisu. This is an obligation that applies only to a Yid. But a guy doesn't bring this. So therefore, for Maisa Behema itself, we know that it doesn't apply to a guy, and from there we learn out in the Hekish that Tumura does not apply to a guy as well. Now Rashi here clarifies that really the main point the Gemara is trying to say is that this that we see that a guy can bring a carbon, it's a limit of the pasuk ish, that's only regarding a donation. A guy could decide to donate a carbon. Obligations of any mitzvahs, there's no such a thing as a guy having an obligation to bring a carbon. So really, the detail that the Gemara says there, ein kavu al azman, that it's not in a set time, that's not the main point. The main point there is that it's a donation that applies to a guy and not something which is an obligation. Maisa Behema is an obligation. Doesn't apply to a guy. The Gemara though is adding ein kavul azman just to make the point that b'chayr is not only something that doesn't apply to a guy, but nothing similar to b'chayr applies to a guy. It's a kind of carbon that doesn't apply to a guy b'chlal. Mashenkin, oila, shlamim, different kinds of karbanis. Let's say a oila that shlamim, they have a set time when a yid has to bring it when it comes to the Beis Hamikdash. Those are karbanis that don't apply to a guy either because it's obligations, but there are karbanis that are similar to it that could be by a guy if a guy decides to donate an oila or donate a shlamim. But there's no such a thing as a guy deciding to donate a Maisa Behema. That doesn't exist. B'chlal. That's what the Gemara is adding that detail there. But the point the Gemara is trying to say is that a guy could only donate a carbon. There's no such a thing as an obligation for a guy to bring a carbon.
Concerning sukkahs with the 70 nations.
That's not the carbon of the guy. It's the karbanis of the 70 that corresponds to the 70 nations. That's the karbanis of Yidden. It's a carbon. No. It's karbanis tzibur that the Yidden bring. The meaning, the content, the idea of the carbon corresponds to the Goyim, but it's not a carbon of a Goy at all. It's karbanis tzibur of Yidden. The next halacha in the Braise, in the Mishnah as well, it said ve'ein. Or actually no, in the Braise, yeah. Ve'ein mevien nesachim. A guy cannot donate. He could donate an animal for a carbon, but not nesachim, wine, which a yid could donate separately. A guy cannot. So Tana Rabbana, we learned in the Braise, the source for this is, it says in the pasuk the word ezrach regarding the nesachim that could be brought separately. When it speaks about the nesachim that are brought with a carbon, so it uses the term ezrach. So ezrach may be nesachim, a citizen amongst Yidden brings nesachim as a separate donation, but ve'ein oiv gechavim may be nesachim. A guy does not bring nesachim. Now Yachel, if that's the case, I would think to say together with his carbon that he's bringing, a carbon oila that he donates. Now, carbon oila requires nesachim with it. So I would think that by the guy, even here with the behema, there's no nesachim either. Talmud loymar kocha. That says in that pasuk, kocha, that the carbon does require nesachim. Right? It's just that the guy, he can't donate nesachim for itself. But the carbon itself, kacha, this is how it has to be brought with nesachim. So whether you have it in the funds of the guy, or even if not, we're going to have to take from the funds of the tzibur to bring the nesachim together with that donation of the oila that the guy brings. The Braisa went on to say, Amar Rabbi Yosi, Roya ani b'kulan lahachmer. Rabbi Yosi says that by all of these, I am machmer, and whatever halacha is by a yid applies by a guy. And then the next detail the Braisa said, which is the Gemara is going to explain first, by med dvarim amurim b'kachim mizbeach. This whole halacha that there's no me'ilah by the carbon of a guy is the carbon that is donating from mizbeach. But by any donations of a guy for funds of hektish, for kachim bedek habayis, there is a din of milah. What's the source for this distinction? My time, what's the reason? Because Kesavat, Rab Shimon here in the Braisa holds, Ki Gomra Me'ila, Chet Mitrume. The whole source that by a goy there's no Me'ila is because we learn Gzeir Shaveh, Chet from what it says by Trume, Mitrume, Dumye the Trume. That's only regarding a carbon which is similar to Trume, which is what? The Kadisha Kedushas Hagof. If it's something that has a kedusha in the body of this thing itself, that's only a carbon that's brought in the mizbeach. There's a kedusha in the body of it itself that's going to be brought and burnt on the mizbeach. Aval kedushas bedek habayis, but donations of a guy to hektish that has a different kind of kedusha. The kedusha is domim. Over here, the kedusha is not in the very body itself. It's a kedusha in the value of it, the monetary value of it. It's a different kind of kedusha. It's not compared to truma. There's a kedusha in the body of the truma itself. Loi. So that's not included in the Gzeir Shaveh from Truma, and therefore the halacha of Me'ila regarding this kachim, even if it was a donation of a guy, it will apply. Tana Rabbanon, we learned in the Braisa. Now this Braisa is going to connect back to the machlokes that we just had here regarding Rab Shimon and Rab Yosi, whether the kachim of a guy is the same like the kachim of a yid, like Rab Yosi's opinion, or not. So the Braisa says as follows: Dam shenitma. Blood of a carbon that becomes tameh. Once the blood becomes tameh, you're not supposed to spray it anymore on the mizbeach. But v'zarkai, the kayan went and sprayed it on the mizbeach. So now b'sheigig, if that was done, b'sheigig hortza. So it's accepted. Why is it accepted? So this is the halacha that it always says regarding tumah, that if it's done b'sheigig, the tzitz that the kayan wears is maratze, it makes it acceptable. That's if it's b'sheigig. B'mezid. However, if it was sprayed b'mezid, then loy hortza, then it will not be accepted. Now Rashi says, really the tzitz is meratze, it makes it to be accepted, whether it was done b'mezid, b'sheigig or b'mezid, it's no difference. But this is a knas midrabanan. Because he did it, Kayin sprayed it b'mezid, chacham v'gayz, it should not be accepted. But Rashi here says, when it says loy hortza, it only means for this, that now the meat of this carbon, you're not allowed to eat from it. Usually, you wait until the blood is sprayed on the mizbeach. Once the blood is sprayed, that now allows you to eat from the meat of the carbon. What it's saying over here, loy hortza, is that you won't be allowed to eat from the meat. But as far as the carbon itself, the owner of the carbon is not going to be obligated to bring a second carbon, because menat Torah, it's accepted. So Chachamim cannot obligate him to bring a second carbon, because then menat Torah, he's bringing chulin into the azara. So therefore, the loy hortza means only regarding the meat that he can't eat it. This distinction between sheigig and mezid, when is this applied? B'yachid, only by an individual that's bringing a carbon. But when it comes to the tzibor, here Chachamim didn't make any knas. There's no gzeirah. So bein b'sheigig, bein b'mezid, the blood that's tamei and the kain sprayed on the mizbeach, whether b'sheigig or b'mezid, hortza, it's accepted. Now, when it comes to a carbon that a guy donated, bein b'sheigig or bein b'mezid, the blood of this carbon that was tamei and it was sprayed on the mizbeach, whether b'sheigig or b'mezid, loy hortza, it's not accepted. Okay, so now here the point, the Braisa here is saying a new thing, that we make a distinction between the carbon of a yid and the carbon of a guy. The tzitz that usually is meratze, that the tumah that there was in the carbon should not disturb, that the carbon will be accepted, that doesn't apply by a guy, whether b'sheigig or b'mezid. So Amru Rabbana Kamei Rav Papa. The Rabbana said in front of Rav Papa regarding this Braisa, Kaman, according to whose opinion is this Braisa? The like Rabbi Yosi, it would seem that it's not like Rabbi Yosi's opinion, because the Rabbi Yosi, if it would be Rabbi Yosi, but Ha'amar, Rabbi Yosi said, B'kulan ani raya lahachmer, that regarding all the halachas mentioned before in the Braisa, that Rab Shimon said that the carbon of a yid and the carbon of a guy is different. Rabbi Yosi says, no, I say that they're the same. We're machmer by a guy the same like by a yid. It says la Hashem on the carbon of a guy, just like the carbon of a yid, so it's the same. So if that's the case regarding this halacha here as well, that the tzitz is meratz, since the carbon of a guy, it says in it la Hashem, the same like the carbon of a yid, Rabbi Yosi should hold that it should be the same. So this Braisa is not like Rabbi Yosi. The Rabbi Yosi, it's the same thing. So Rav Papa said to the Rabbana, not necessarily. Afilatayim Rabbi Yosi. This Braisa could be like Rabbi Yosi's opinion. Shani Hasam, but over here regarding the tzitz being meratze, accepting the carbon when it's tamei, because the Amakra, the pasuk says lahem, as it says there, v'hoyal meitzach arain. The tzitz is on the forehead of Aaron, v'nasa Aaron is avena kadoshim, and then the pasuk lachamer, so it says there, v'hoyal mitzchet tamid l'ratzain lahem. So that's only for you, lahem v'loy le'evdik chavim, and not for a guy. So therefore, the tzitz is not meratze for the carbon of a guy. That's a different drasha in that pasuk about tzitz that even Rabbi Yosi would agree to. Amalei Rav Huna bereded Rav Nosson Rav Papa. So Rav Huna bereded Rav Nosson asked Rav Papa, if this is how you darshaning, even according to Rav Yosi, so Elamayata, if so, regarding one of the things mentioned earlier that Rab Shimon said is different between the carbon of a yid and the carbon of a guy, and that's the halacha of tumah. So, and over there, Rabbi Yosi said that the halacha of tumah applies the same by a yid and a guy. So look over there, the pasuk by tumah. It says Asheheim Makdishim, that you should be careful not to make the carbon tameh, and it says heim. So Hachanamia, you're going to darshan here as well this word, heim v'loyev dikachavim. You should darshan, there's the same kind of a drasha. And Rabbi Yosi should agree that the halachas of the tumah that apply by a yid should not apply by a guy. Just like you darshan the word lahem by the tzitz. So Elam Ravashi, therefore Ravashi says that the word lahem is not the source. Rabbi Yosi doesn't darshan that. And the word heim here as well, he doesn't darshan. Rather, there's a different point. Omakra, by the tzitz, when it says that it's meratze. So what does the pasuk say? L'rotzein, that the tzitz will be malvaya mitzchay tomid l'rotzen lahem lefnei Hashem. So l'rotzen lahem v'oiv degechavim. That's l'rotzen only for yidden. The word rotzen is the main drasha here. V'oiv degechavim lav b'nei artzaninu. This rotzen of the Eibishter does not apply to a guy. This special concept that the Eibishter is mechaper for a yid. So there's not, a guy doesn't have that connection. It's not the word lahem, the extra word lahem. It's the concept. The concept of the rotzen applies to a yid and not to a guy. Therefore, regarding this halacha, Rabbi Yosi will agree that the tzitz is not meratze for the carbon of a guy. Those parts of the carbon that the halacha of pigel to be chayiv kodesh, if you eat from it, does not apply by it. We had a list in the two mishnahs before where it said that there are certain parts of the carbon that there's no din of pigel for it. The Gemara before, the Mishnah and the Gemara before explained that what does the din of pigel apply to? If it's a part of the carbon that there was an avodah before that has to be done to be mater it, to be eaten or to be put on the mizbeach. It's regarding those parts of the carbon that the din of pigel applies. But there's other parts of the carbon that don't have a mater. There's no other avodah that's mater it. And it's separate. It itself just has to be burnt in the mizbeach. So there's no, or the blood, for example, the blood that's sprayed on the mizbeach, there's no din of pigel regarding that. So regarding these things, chayav aleim mishum neiser and mishum tameh. You will be chayiv though for neiser and for tameh if you ate from it when it was left over, or the person ate from it when he was tameh. He will be chayiv kares for this, even though there's no pigel, but the din of neiser and tameh does apply to it. Chutz min adam. Besides, regarding the blood of the carbon, there's no pigel. You're obviously not allowed to drink the blood of the carbon either way. There's a chi of kodesh actually to drink from blood. However, but regarding pigel, neiser, and tameh, those isurim will not apply to this blood. Rab Shimon mechayev b'dava shedarkei lechol, darkon lechol. Rab Shimon says that it depends. If it's something that is edible, so over here, even if it's something that the din of pigel does not apply, but the din of neiser and tameh will apply. However, if it's the wood of the carbon, frankincense, or the ketaides, this is the incense of ketaides, which is not edible, if a person would go and eat it, it's not edible, a person would go and eat it anyways, while he's tameh, he would not be chayiv for this. So we learned in the Braise the source of this halacha. Yochayil, I would think to say, lo yichayav mishum tumeh, that one should not be chayiv for tumeh of when he's tumeh and he eats from the carbon. El al davar sheyesh lo matirin. Only if this is something that is a part of the carbon, that is something else that's done to be matir it. And that's bein la'adam, whether there's something that an avodah that's done before to be matir it, bein la'adam, for the person to eat from it, and bein la'mizbeach, or to be matir it for the mizbeach. Just like the halach is by pigel. Pigel only takes effect on something that has another thing, another stage of the avodah that's matir it. And avidinu. And I would learn this out from pigel with a kal v'chaimer. Oma pigel, if I see by pigel, which is something that's so stringent. Shu b'kviyah. Because pigel, you have to bring a carbon on it. If someone ate from pigel b'shaygig, so what kind of carbon do you bring for this? A carbon chatos, and it's a set carbon chatos that's the same by everybody. Ubi achas, and by pigel, even if the person ate from the pigel b'shaygig, and before he ate from the pigel, he had no awareness that this is pigel. Only afterwards he found out. So there was only one yediyah afterwards. And also another stringency v'leihotam meklale. By the isser of pigel, there's never a situation where you're allowed to eat from the pigel. So all these stringencies, but nevertheless, there's a leniency that Ein Chayav and Olav, we limit the Isser that you're not Chayav El Al Davar Sheyesh Le Matirin, Bein LaAdam, Bein LeMizbeach. It is only to the parts of the carbon that there's another matter that's being matered for you or for the Mizbeach. So now if so, Tumeh, the Chi of Kod is by Tumeh when one eats from a carbon when he's Tameh, Shehi Ba'ila V'Yayrit. The carbon that's brought for this Isser is lighter, because we're more flexible. Depends if the person's rich or poor. Rich, he brings a behemah. If he's poor, he can bring a bird or flower. So it's a carbon that's on a scale. And also a b'shtei. Another leniency, you only bring the carbon by tumah when you eat from kachim when you tameh, if the person had a yediyah first, he was aware that he's tameh. Then he forgot, then he remembered again. And also v'hutra b'klala. It's a isser that there's a exception for this when it's mutter. By the carbon Pesach, if the whole tzibur is tameh, so then they can bring the carbon, they can even eat from the carbon Pesach, as if when most of the tzibur is tameh. So you have all these leniencies. So definitely we should apply this limitation that the isser of the tumah should only be regarding the part of the carbon that has a matter, like it is by pigel. Talmud Loimar, that's why I have the pasuk that it says, by tumah, asher hey magdishim li. That the tumah, the halacha of the person that's not allowed to eat from the carbon that when he's tameh, it says for anything that he's yimakdish. And that means all kachim, all parts of the carbon, all the parts of the carbon that you makdish to be kachim. If so, yochel, I would think to say miyat, that when you makdish a carbon and the person is tameh and he eats from it, he should be chayiv as soon as he's makdish this carbon, and he eats from it when he's tameh, he would be chayiv kares. Talmud Loimar, no, the pasuk there says yikrav. This is actually in a different place. The pasuk says that ish asher yikrav mikol zarachem ala kachim v'tumasi olav v'nichrisa. Yikrav, he gets close. If he gets close to the carbon and he's tameh, what does this mean? So Amar Rabbi Lazar, what do I learn out from this word yikrav? V'chiyesh negeyeshu chayiv. Could you learn the type of the word of this yikrav literally? That if a person touches a carbon while he's tameh, that'll be chayiv kares. We know that there's no chayiv kares if you touch kachim when you're tameh. Only if you eat from it. The Gemara learned out earlier in the Masechta a source for that. So you can't say that yikrav here means that he got close and he touched it, that he's going to be chayiv kares. Elamat tamud leime yikrav. So what does the word yikrav here in the pasuk mean? It's not talking about the person. It's talking about the carbon. When are you chayiv on kachim if you eat from it when you're tameh? Only after the carbon is huchshar, is already prepared to be makriv on the mizbeach or to eat from the person for the person. That's when you're chayiv for it. Okay, so what does this mean? Yesh loy matirin. If we're talking about a part of the carbon that there's a certain avodah that has to be done to be matirid, then mishi karvu matirov after you did all those parts to be matirid. And now it's yikrav. You could burn it on the mizbeach, or the person could eat from it. Then, if you eat it from it when you're tameh, you're going to be chayiv. Ein loy matirin. And if it's a carbon that there's no matirin for this part of the carbon, as we said that the tumah, the isser of tumah applies even when there's no matirin for it. So mishiyikdash bekeli. Once you will makdish it in the klisharis, that's when the halacha of the person that's tameh that eats from it will be chayiv kares, but not before, not as soon as you makdish it. This is the halacha of tumah. From here, this is the brayso that explains that there's no pigul, there's no chiyuv of pigul, but there is a chiyuv of tumah. Now, ashkechon tumah. This is the source of what the Mishnah said, that there's the chiyuv of tumah for this. Noiser minalan. How do I know that it applies to noiser as well? As asi chilul mitumah, because noiser is learned out with the gzeir shaveh of chilul from tumah. Just like tumah applies even regarding the parts of the carbon where there's no pigul, the same with noiser it applies even when there's no chiyuv of pigul, or for all the parts of the carbon. In fact, the Gemara, why are you learning it out chilul from tumah v'leileiv? But I have another option. I can learn out gzeir shaveh Ovain mi pigul. Instead of learning out noiser from tumah, learn out the gzeir shaveh ovain. As we had before, that you have both of these gzeir shavas. So you have also the gzeir shavah of the word ovain that it says by noiser, and the word ovain that it says by pigul. And maybe we should say, just like pigul only applies to certain parts of the carbon that have a matter, maybe the same should be regarding noiser. And says the Gemara, no. If we have an option of two gzeir shavas, we go by what's more logical. Mistavre, it's logical to say that you should learn out from tumah. Sheken Gezel Siman, because we have a siman of three things: Gimel, Zayin, Lamed, where Naisar and Tumeh are compared to each other. So what's the Gimel, Zayin, Lamed? The Gimel means that both of them are psul in a guf, in an entity, in the existence of it. It's not just a psul in a machshava. The Tumeh is a Tumeh in the body of the person, and the Naisar is the Naisar in the body of the basar itself. It's not left over. It's not a machshava. It's a physical thing, physical existence. The Zayin is that they're both things that are related to time. Pigul is time, and sorry, the Zayin is not Zrike, sorry. By both of them, the Zayin refers to Zrike. Both of them, it's not the Zrike. Here, this is something which is not. Both of them, it's not the Zrike of the dam that brings it to psul. By pigul, when you spray the blood and you spray it and you have the wrong machshava, that brings it to the psul of pigul. Not by tumah and naisa. Tumah and naisa is not related to a machshava that you have by the zrika. That's the zayin. And lamed is that by both of them, it says the word chilul. So therefore you should learn them out from each other. The lamed is the lamed, the two lameds of the word chilul. So you have three things that they're compared to. Therefore I say the gzeira shava from naisa to tumah. So it's a Gemara Adarabe. If you're looking at the logically what's more compared, mi pigul avalele melaf. You should compare Naisa to pigul. Shekain hotar, tzitz, toir, bizman, karev. Because you have all these things that they are compared to each other. Number one, regarding the concept of hotar, by tumeh, there's a time when there's a heta for it. Even b'tzibur, there's a heta for it. You don't find such a thing not regarding Naisar, not regarding pigul. So both Naisar and pigul are compared to each other that they're not hutar. There's never a heta for it. Tzitz, by Naisar and by Naisar and by pigul, there's no such a thing as a tzitz that's meratze. By tumah there is. So Naisar and pigul are compared that they don't have this concept of tzitz. Tahir, both Naisar and pigul are both tahir. Tumeh is a different category. It's something which is tumeh. And bizman, they're both Naisar and pigul are both things that are a problem related to time. Naisar is that he left it beyond its time, and pigul is that he had a machshavet, he eat it after its time. So they're both things that are beyond its time. Korev, and the benigaya to Naisar and pigul, they're both things that relate to the korev. They're both psulim that relate to the basar of the that has to be from the carbon itself that's brought. The tumah is, we're talking about the tumah of the person, the bala carbon, the gavra, the person, not going to get to the korev, not going to get to the behemoth, the carbon itself. So we have all these details that we see that Naisar is actually compared to pigul. So v'hani nefishan, the Gemara says there's more reasons to compare Naisar to pigul than to compare Naisar to tumah. So we can't say that this is all this gzeira shava, and because there's a svara to this. Therefore, the Gemara says, Ella, the source to say that we compare Naisar to Tumeh is a drasha. With the Tani Levi learned this out, the Tani Levi, Minayin, how do I know Sha'af, B'psul Zman, Akos of Medaber. The pasuk we brought before, Sheheim Magdishimli, that says regarding Tumeh, that all karbanis, the halacha, all parts of the carbon, the halacha of Tumeh applies, not like pigul, that it's only certain parts. How do I know that in that pasuk it's also referring to the Psul Zman, which is the Psul of Naisar? Talmud Loimar, so in that pasuk it says, V'lo yechalalu es kotche b'nei Yisrael. The actual lashon of the pasuk is, V'lo yechalalu ela kotche ma sheyakdishu b'nei Yisrael. So it uses the term V'lo yechalalu. So here, because it says, by the Tumeh, in that pasuk, it says yechalalu, two lamets. Shouldn't desecrate, but it uses two lamets. So because of the two lamets, b'shnei chalulu and akasim medaber, the pasuk is speaking about another desecration. Echad psul naisar, echad psul tameh. One is naisar and one is tameh, because we find by naisar as well, the Torah uses the term chilul, it's kodesh Hashem chilul. So over here as well, in this pasuk where it says hey makdishim, and we say that tumah applies to all parts of the carbon, the double lamed includes that it applies to naisar as well.